Welcome to the B5+1 forum. The initiative Business 5+1, connecting businesses from 5 Central Asian countries with the United States, is closely aligned to the commitment set by New York declarations during the C5+1 Presidential Summit last year in 2023. And at today's forum, we bring not only political leaders, but also business leaders to have this public-private partnership dialogue. And the brilliant mind behind this initiative, the concept, is Eric Hontz. Eric Hontz is the director for Center for Accountable Investment at CIPE, which stands for Center for International Private Enterprise. And from today's interview, we would like to get from him the first-hand insight about the idea behind this concept, and on behalf of CIPE, the long-term vision toward B5+1 initiative. Hi, Eric. It's such a great pleasure to have you because at the B5+1 forum, I had the privilege of interviewing Nicolas Berliner. He is a special assistant to the president and the director for Russia and the Central Asia at the National Security Council of the United States. So he provided more the political perspective on the importance of the regional integrations. I also interviewed Dr. Frederick Starr, who is the chairman of Central Asia and the Caucasus Institute, the founding father of the COMCA network. So he provided us more like a historical context. Yeah. It's like why this region. Actually, we were kind of very in close part with each other. So I think with your expertise in economics and investment, I would like to kindly invite you to shed more light on the importance of regional integrations from the economic perspective. Does it really economically make sense to have all the Central Asian 5 countries and +1? Because I understand there's a simple calculation, right? When you put all the population, it's become a bigger market. Yeah. Nevertheless, all these 5 countries, they have very different economic contexts, and there's a significant geographic distance to the United States. Could you please shed more light on that?
Sure. So first things first, taking the 2 questions in order. So the first question, I think Central Asia is probably, if not the most disaggregated or separate economic space in the world. If it's not the most, it's very close. Usually neighbors trade with one another. That's just the way it is. In the United States, our biggest trading partners are Canada and Mexico. Most trade occurs with those states that are on your borders. In the case of Central Asia, we see that your neighbors are, the 3rd or the 5th or the 12th in some cases in order of rank of trade volume. So we kind of look at the question, why is that? And there's a lot of artificial barriers for trade within and among Central Asia. There's a bit of a beggar thy neighbor approach, a zero-sum mentality where if Uzbekistan gets the investment, then the Kazakhs don't get the investment. If Tajikistan receives a big project, then the Kyrgyz lose out. And so that mentality has really undermined some of the economic prospects of the region as a whole. As you say, if we would take the Central Asia region as a more cohesive economic bloc, then we have a scale of magnitude much larger. So we have 78, 80 million people that have pathways towards Russia, towards China, but also towards Europe its the Caspian. The second part of the question about the United States' role. Now, the United States is a large investor in Kazakhstan. Its trade turnover with Uzbekistan is something a little under $1 billion a year, which is respectable for being half a world away. I don't think that the United States, given the geographic distance, will ever be the number 1 trading partner of Central Asia. But I do think that the United States has a role here to convene the states together. And that was really part of the C5+1 from the government perspective. So after several years of the C5+1 and the government process and the iterative process of the development of more cohesive government-to-government relations, began to look around and say, well, what's missing here? And what was missing was the private sector. Because the private sector, in our interviews and our work, our research, was really driving or really hungry for regional cooperation and better standard setting across the region so they could trade with one another.
Thank you so much for providing this concept, especially for our audience who first time heard about the C5+1 and B5+1. B5+1 is inspired by the C5+1, but with a more focus on the role of the private sector. Yes?
Exactly. So if you look at the other large groupings of nations, so you have a G7 summit where the governments of the G7 countries meet with each other. There's always a parallel summit that goes on among the business communities, and they produce their own documents of the business priorities as they view them among the G7 countries, and that's called a B7. Likewise, in the G20 format, there's a B20 format. And so given the importance of the C5+1 as a government-to-government relationship, I think that the B5+1 is likewise a very important step towards greater, more comprehensive engagement with the region.
Mm-hmm. And this concept was initiated by the United States of America.
It
just
was.
the beginning.
It was. I'd like to say that in the case of the B5+1, that CIPE right now, the Center for National Private Enterprise, is taking the leading role in kickstarting this. Mm-hmm. But we want to see greater buy-in from all Central Asian states and greater sustainability in the process of creating this forum.
That's lovely. And I do like this diversity of our forum participation. So I check out who are the participants, presenting which kind of organizations. We have policymakers, businesses, civil society, media, and so on. More than 200 people actually gathered in today's forums. This kind of cross-sectoral dialogues. If I may want to visualize this dialogue, I see this vertical dialogue and horizontal dialogue. What I mean, vertical, for example, starting from the policymakers to businesses to the civil society and so on. Could you please, and the horizontal, I mean this kind of cross countries, like from different countries. This is just, I briefly summarize like that based on my observations. Could you please provide some recommendation, because it often feels like business and the government, they're talking in very different languages. They're working in silos. What would be your recommendations to better facilitate this collaboration between business, the public sector, between business, the private sector, and the government, the public sector?
So great question. The motto or the theme of this conference is business partnerships, regional prosperity. And we ordered that in that order for a reason. Business partnership means that the businesses are the ones that feel the pain points of policy, right? Where some things just not working. What's not working for the business community? What we've done is tried to help articulate what is wrong, but also constructive solutions to that. And so it's not a top-down dialogue where government is setting the policy, but rather a bottom-up conversation where businesses say, look, we're having issues with X, Y, Z. We've consulted with some economists, we've engaged policy, think tanks, and we have a couple of solutions here, Mr. and Mrs. Government. We need help in really articulating a better policy on this specific subject. And it's really not about pointing fingers or blaming anybody. It's about getting to better policy results, which result in prosperity and economic growth. That's the end goal.
Absolutely. We do believe business can provide a very pragmatic approach in addressing this, what is the region really needed. When it comes to the horizontal dialogue, when it cross-country border kind of dialogues, many times we see the bilateral cooperation, like United States with Kazakhstan, United States with Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and so on, versus this multilateral collaborations, as truly all the Central Asian countries together with the United States and further with the world economy. Is there any kind of priority or where we should focus on, or you think we need to actually apply both approaches in parallel?
Well, I think that for some issues, banking regulation, for example, you're going to have that one-on-one relationship just because the nation state is still the foundation of that regulatory regime. Now, unless Central Asia would create a common economic market and a common monetary policy, which I don't see happening anytime soon, then there would be a more multilateral dialogue as there is with the US and the EU. But for other issues, you can engage in more of the whole of Central Asia. So agricultural standards, you can negotiate, I would say, more collectively as Central Asia with the EU, for example, to have common standards among the Central Asia 5 states and engage with U.S. agriculture or export or import, same with the EU. So you develop these common standards that are the same standards in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and you know that those standards are acceptable to EU or US or Japanese markets. So you have this baseline. Then the advantage of that is that since you've already agreed on this common standard for export, you have a common standard within the market. And so you're much more easily trade within Central Asia and export to the world.
But is that process, is it really kind of possible to have this kind of common grounds, a common standard among Central Asia countries?
It is really difficult, but nothing in life that's worth
impossible.
doing is easy, right? If it was easy, it would have already been done. And so, I think that we have a political leadership in the region. We have political leadership in the United States. We've got business leadership here in Central Asia, business leadership in the United States that want to see this happen. And so the idea here is to get those leaders together and say, look, we have a common agenda here. The common agenda is prosperity for Central Asia. How do we get there? Now, hopefully with this conference, we get a couple of concrete steps in the short term to take those first initial steps towards that greater goal of broader regional prosperity. But we can't just kind of name prosperity as the goal and leave it up to policymakers. It requires a lot of work.
Yes.
And we want to get down to, as we say, brass tacks. So some specific recommendations coming out of the forum that we can work on over the next 12 to 18 months and then come back in a second edition of the forum and say, look, okay, we've agreed to this at the first forum. We've made this much progress. Here's how we have to go. We're going to add on a few more things, and we're going to continue down that road together, private sector, public sector, hand in hand, to develop prosperity throughout the region.
So recognizing this process of having a regional integration and regional collaboration is actually a very complicated process, but we still believe there is a hope for that. And we just start from the baby step,
Yes.
step by step, starting from the forum like B5+1 to come up with a more actionable, concrete roadmap.
Exactly. So the EU wasn't born in a day, neither was ASEAN. And so any kind of regional bloc, you look historically, and it started out with something small. It could have been a specific customs policy in ASEAN. In Europe, it was coal and steel tariffs among 5 states. And so they started with something specific, and then slowly over time, as trust built up and that institutional collaboration across those horizontal areas developed, they began to get more comfortable and develop more trust working with one another and to develop those regional areas of economic cooperation.
Awesome. Eric, you're based in the United States, and you also constantly, frequently have this interaction with other international, let's say, investors or kind of business communities. Could you please also share what, in your view, what kind of investment landscape of Central Asia, what kind of investment opportunities of Central Asia we can provide for American and international partners?
Well, I mean, I'll leave aside the critical minerals discussion because that's been already discussed, and there is a new U.S. Central Asia dialogue on critical minerals. But beside that, there's a lot of interest in tech startups and tech cooperation. We have here at the forum today Google and a number of other U.S. tech companies. We see a great opportunity for transport and logistics, especially if we kind of expand on the middle corridor and routes through the Caucasus into Turkey and to Europe. We see opportunities really within Central Asia for just fundamental economic growth in almost every sphere.
But then how about from the different perspective? Let's say Central Asia generally is less known to the American community or society or to the global market. What would be your recommendation for Central Asian countries as individual countries or Central Asia as a region, how we should better advocate our collective advantages as a region?
Yeah, This goes back, I think perhaps because Central Asia is less well known, perhaps the area where Central Asia can agree to cooperate among the 5 states themselves is that tourism sector, right? There's a lot of low-hanging fruit for tourism industry to develop in Central Asia. And as you have more travelers coming in from South Korea and India, EU and the US, it becomes more known and more popularized. Central Asia has a lot to offer. It's often called this transit corridor.
Yep.
And I think that's very disparaging because it says, well, it's transit, you're going through it, there's nothing really there. But Central Asia has this rich tapestry and rich history that is really a world heritage. And perhaps through tourism cooperation among the Central Asian 5 states, we can develop greater acknowledgement worldwide about Central Asia's role in the development of humanity and civilization, and really have people experience the cultures of Central Asia in new and exciting ways. And that will bring around the opportunities for greater business growth. And so, as it was steel and coal in the European context, perhaps tourism is the context here where we can get that baseline agreement on certain regulatory barriers to begin to kind of integrate and begin to coordinate among our economies and foster both greater global understanding of Central Asia, but also easier transit across Central Asia.
Wonderful. Thank you for this kind of positive perspective towards that. So in closing of today's interview, I think Eric provided very pragmatic view from the economic, how this economically makes sense for Central Asia to come together to forge this regional economy. And we also understood having such a public-private dialogue, it is very critically important to accelerate the regional integration and economic development of our regions. This kind of collaboration between the government and the businesses can provide us an innovative approach for us to pave towards attracting more international investment opportunities. So despite we have a different economical diversity and the geographical some distances with the United States, but there's still the sense of the unity in purpose. There's a shared belief that if we come together, we can overcome all this barrier, like you mentioned. So this forum, B5+1 forum, I believe is not only just about the business, but also about building the bridges, forging those connections and creating a better future for generations to come.
Exactly.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Eric.
you.
Thank you very much.